does seem to me we face a choice, and the choice is fundamental. Lincoln said a house divided against itself cannot stand. I don't think the house is going to fall, but it's got to become one way or the other. And that's what I think is the situation today. Of course, Lincoln's taking that from the Bible, but both places are good authorities. What is the nature of the choice? It's a different set of principles and a different set of political practices that follow on them. In one set of principles, we are a thing with a nature. The nature is in the middle of the order of creation, and because it is there, we are capable of government, and we require government, and government is required to be limited. Because the same thing that makes us need laws makes it necessary that those who administer the laws also live under law and restraint. That's that kind of government. The new kind of government is a government really about progress, about history, about changes over time. And the claim of that kind of government is we've advanced to a place in science and technology and organization and knowledge so that we can actually take control of everything. And that means the government can be big and needs to be, because it can do so much more than used to be possible, and because so much more in a modern complex society is needed to be done. And the old restraints are in the way, and they impede us from being what we can be. Those are the two claims, right? And as I say, they're not compatible with each other. You can have one or the other, but you can't have both. And that's the choice that's pending now.
Hello, my name is Jacob. I'm a sophomore majoring in politics at Hillsdale College. This is part of a 10-week course, Constitution 101, presented by Hillsdale College. Today you will hear from Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College, on the recovery of the Constitution. Please watch.
Welcome back. This is the conclusion to a big adventure. I hope you found it so. We have. We've been taking you through the history of the Constitution of the United States, trying to uncover its meaning and uncover the nature of the great debate that it's always provoked, and especially the contemporary version of that debate. You've studied by now the founding. You've heard some lectures about that. You understand the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. You've studied the document, the Constitution itself, why it should have the form that it has and the way it gives a form to the American people. You studied the debate over those two documents. And then, of course, not long after those, we get the Civil War, the crisis in slavery. The question, how should we deal with slavery? Is it an evil thing, and should it be restricted, and if so, by what constitutional means? And you've studied what about the claim that arose that slavery was good and ought to be extended? Big questions. And then after the Civil War, another form of the same question rose up. Is it true that history, that circumstance and time and perspective are the dominant shapers of the human being? And do they change the meaning of the government over time? Do they change what its shape should be? And so you've been introduced to that debate and the kind of government that's implied by an answer yes to that question of history. And you don't have to imagine very hard what kind of government is implied by that, an answer yes to that history. You can just look about you, because we have a lot of that government about us today. So it's our purpose in this to raise up a choice, and there's no better way to conclude than by trying to make a contrast. And so in our last set of readings, there is a contrast apparent, and I'm going to pick one of the documents in one side of that contrast and one document in the other side, and just talk about those two. One is the speech by Franklin Roosevelt, the speech by which he launched his 1932 presidential campaign, and another is a speech by Ronald Reagan, a speech by which he assumed the presidency of the United States in 1981. So we're going to go through those for a few minutes, and they'll make, I hope, a good conclusion. In the Commonwealth Address, it's called, from 1932, Franklin Roosevelt writes this thing. The Declaration of Independence discusses the problem of government in terms of contract. Government is a relation of give and take, a contract, perforce. If we would follow the thinking out of which it grew, under such a contract, rulers were accorded power, and the people consented to that power on consideration that they be accorded certain rights. So we set up a contract, and the contract goes, according to Roosevelt, and what he's doing here, he says, is characterizing the Declaration of Independence. I'll give you power, but I get, by the terms of the contract, he says, accorded certain rights. And then he goes on, the task of statesmanship has always been the redefinition of these rights in terms of a changing and growing social order. This is a speech giving an explanation of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence happens to be just under 1,400 words long, so it's not a big job to go look up and see what it in fact actually says, and you've been through that, but I'll just remind you. It doesn't say that we sign a contract under which we're accorded certain rights. It says something else. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, what could that word unalienable mean, except that you couldn't really sign a contract to get rid of them? And if you're endowed with them by your Creator, you wouldn't actually find them in any contract that you made with another human being, ruler or not. And what about this redefinition of these rights in terms of a changing social order? The Declaration of Independence begins with a sweeping sentence, very famous, when in the course of human events. When in the course of human events. That means any old time, right? That doesn't mean today, and it doesn't mean in the feudal era, and it doesn't mean in the Greek era, and it doesn't mean in China. It doesn't mean any place either. It means in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind require they declare the causes. Now, what I say here is that in the Commonwealth Address, this is just a misreading of the Declaration of Independence. That's not what it says. And there's a reason for the misreading, because the whole Commonwealth Address is a story of change. And in this story of change, it's Roosevelt's claim that because things are not the same, the conditions are not the same as the time of the Declaration of Independence, the document itself has to be read differently, and the rights in it have to be redefined. They're not the same. They're not these inalienable rights. Written, Alexander Hamilton, historian Rick Brookhiser, a friend of mine, has called this the best sentence that Alexander Hamilton ever wrote. It might be the best sentence anybody ever wrote, as good as any anyway. He says, the sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among dusty parchments. They are written, rather, as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of divinity itself. Think what kind of way of talking that is. And my point is, this is in the Commonwealth Address, a different way of talking. And its claim, by the way, that everything shifts fundamentally with time, that's not an adjustment of the original claim. If that's true, then the original claim about the laws of nature, of nature's God, is false. And if the original claim, and by the way, if it's true now, or if it was true in 1932, that everything shifts with time and rights are redefined by time and circumstance, if that was true in 1932, then that was true in 1776. And that means in 1776 the Declaration of Independence was false. And if, on the other hand, if in 1776 the Declaration of Independence was true, then in 1932, the Commonwealth Address is false. Now, I don't have to argue which one is which. You can figure that out yourself. You're a citizen. You get to vote. Because a very different kind of government is implied by these two claims. Roosevelt's claim in the Commonwealth Club Address is, in the new conditions, you can't be secure in your property unless the government can guarantee your property. But of course, it can't guarantee your property unless it also has a claim on all your property. And so that's different. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall property be taken for public use. And see, if you lose your property and the government takes my property, say, to give it to you to make it up, it hasn't actually taken it for public use. Taken it for a private use. This is for public use without just compensation. So that, too, is a difference. And you may like the difference, the newer version, and you may like the older version. What I'm telling you is they don't go together. It's been explained to you that probably Professor Pastrito, if he didn't explain it in these lectures, send me an email and I'll send you a really great article he wrote on separation of powers in the context of progressive era in the bureaucratic state. Because what comes to happen is this view that to have a government that can adjust to these changing circumstances that change everything, including the definition of our rights, we have to have a government that's a very different kind of thing than the one we had before. We have to have a government where people who work in it are professionally qualified and scientifically trained. That will make them trustworthy. Where they have tenure and their wants satisfied. That will mean they won't want anything else, and so they won't really have interest that they pursue, and they'll be neutral as to politics. So that's the idea, and then such a new kind of administration can't be subjected to the old restraints of representation and limits on scope and separation of powers. That's the claim. And the claim is made in this Commonwealth Address by Roosevelt that that's a natural outgrowth of the change in time and circumstances. But I'm saying that change in time and circumstances is not compatible with the claim in the Declaration of Independence. And remember about the Declaration, by the way, that it is kind of a novelty itself, because the argument had been very prevalent in the world that sovereignty belongs in certain families or certain noble groups, and that people have to obey. And they had said, no, it can never be there. It's in each equal soul. And this new claim is also a kind of claim that the public interest demands that certain people be appointed to act as they please outside the bounds of the Constitution for the public good. So the argument is not entirely unknown to the founders. The king said things that were similar in his protest against them. And above all, about these constitutional restraints, James Madison justifies the whole system and my argument, I'll repeat it at the end, but my own personal argument, and I think my colleagues probably agree with me, is that the key things about the Constitution are isolatable as three, and one of them is that it calls for a government that is limited, and that you can find that also endorsed in the Declaration of Independence in the charges against the king. And that the second, that this limited government will have sovereignty outside the government, and the people through the institution of representation. That is to say, everybody working in the government will be a representative of the people outside the government. And there's no source for government inside the government. And then the third thing, following on the first two, is if the sovereignty over the government is outside the government, and if the government proceeds by representation, then through representation the people can delegate the powers of government to different groups, and so you can have separation of powers, both among the three branches of government and up and down the two levels of government. The Constitution recognizes all of that. So you have separation of powers and federalism, and they are logical parallels in this three-part system of limited government, separation of powers, and representation. And Hamilton doesn't say, James Madison, writing in the 51st Federalist, describing all these checks and balances and internal and external controls on the government, doesn't say, we live in a time here in this new world where we've developed to a certain stage where all the circumstances make it right and good that we should have a government that's characterized by these three constitutional institutions. He says in the 51st Federalist, what is government but the profoundest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be needed. That means we can't do without government, which is also, by the way, very clearly the understanding of the Declaration of Independence. And if angels were to govern men, neither internal nor external controls on the government would be necessary. So as long as men are not angels, and angels do not govern men, Madison's opinion is you're going to have a constitution that's divided up along these lines. And it's a very interesting claim, that claim about men and angels, because you can't really understand the principle of equality in the Declaration of Independence until you understand that what equality means is not surely that we're all the same height. For example, I just stopped in the dining hall at lunchtime today, and our basketball team here at Hillsdale College had a very big victory against a very fine group of people. It's very difficult to beat. We hardly ever beat them. And darned if we didn't beat them last night. And, I was sitting with a center and a forward and an off guard and a point guard. And the point guard is just a really short guy, but he's about 4 inches taller than I am. So these guys are very big, right? We're not equal in our height, right? And there's some kids walking around here, and gosh, are they not smart. It's just scary how smart they are. Every time they open their mouth, they sound like I should sound when I sound right on a really good day, and I'm 59 years old. How do they do that? God gave them something special, right? We're not all equal that way. How are we equal then? Well, the answer is obvious, right? And by the way, the answer is written in the Declaration of Independence. God appears there 4 times. Once as each branch of government. Once as the creator. All the powers of government implies the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, implies grandly and beautifully. Could not be combined in a single set of hands unless those hands were divine. And we're not like that. So we men, in our equality, and women, are below God. But also we're above something that you can see very easy. And that is, my favorite story is they took a pig on U.S. Air on a flight from Philadelphia to San Francisco. A lady said she wanted the pig to go because the pig was her therapeutic pet companion. And darned if the big old hog didn't get on the U.S. Air flight, whatever it was. I think this was in the year 2000. And the pig didn't act right. It smeared its snout on the window of the airplane, and it stuck its snout in people's laps, and it got panicked a little bit when there was some turbulence, and it ran squealing up and down the aisle of the aircraft, and the report in the paper is that there was some incontinence from the pig at this time. People noticed that this darn thing on this plane was a pig. And if it had been like a really badly acting passenger, or if it had been one of those really big young men that I just described who are so obviously different from all the rest of us. One of those boys is 6'9", I think. He's a very large young man. If they'd been on the plane, everybody would have noticed them. They're like outliers. They're really big guys, right? But they're not as big guys as this pig. They wouldn't look as odd as this pig, because the pig looked really weird on the plane, right? Because the point is, the pig doesn't go on the plane. And U.S. Air, I'm glad to report, announced later that they wouldn't be having any more therapeutic pet companion pigs on the plane. And so we're different from the pig, right? We're below the angels, and we're above the beasts. As long as we're that way, the claim goes, in the founding of America, you're going to have a government that is limited. And the modern claim is that that's not so. That circumstances change, and these natural facts, as they're claimed to be in the founding, come and go with time. And the point is, And what has to be sharp in your mind, in my belief, in my argument, for you to really understand this, is that these two things don't go together, and you can't have both of them. You must have one or the other. And that's why, by the way, the study of the Constitution, which I said at the beginning of this thing, is beautiful to do. I mean, it's really wonderful to try to think these things through, isn't it? First of all, you're understanding your own government, and there's something good about that. But in addition, these claims lead you to think about the most fundamental things. You have to think about them. That's one reason why so many of the great classic works, Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics, Aristotle's Ethics, are works that have profoundly to do with political life, even as they are explorations of the whole nature of things. So it's beautiful to do this, but also it's urgently important to do this because a whole way of life is implied by each of these two systems. And from the point of view of each of the two claims, the contemporary claim and the founding claim, from each of their 2 points of view, they agree on this. They agree that the other way is disastrous. It's not like one of them says, okay, you could do it that way too, that'd be great. Neither one of them says that. Both of them say, that's awful. You can't have them both. So, I'm afraid you're going to be required to choose. It's not for me to tell you how to choose. I have an argument, and we here at Hillsdale College have an argument about the terms of the choice. And it's really, we're a teaching outfit, right? So, I invite you to study and think. Now, I want to close with a curiosity, and it's a curiosity that's very telling. If you look at the Constitution Reader that the college has published and from which we teach our course, the second half of it is very different from the first half because roughly the first half of it contains about as much text that likes the look of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence as doesn't like the look of those two things. But the second half is almost bereft of people who favor the old system. Overwhelmingly written by the documents that are produced in it are produced by people who think that the old system requires fundamental adjustment of the kind I've been naming. And remember, my argument is this adjustment is a destruction. It's not compatible with the old way. So why would we do it that way? And the answer is, I'm sorry to report, is that that's what seems fair. It seems to me that the great majority of thought and speech in American politics for the last 50 years and maybe 100 years is by people who think that the founding must be discarded in important respects. And so you'll get a lot of that, and you've had a very great deal of that in these seminars. But I'm going to close with the last two things. I'm only going to talk about one of them because they are a shining exception or a glaring exception, depending on your point of view. They're both written by Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, it happens, was a visitor here at the college. Several of us knew him pretty well, admired him a lot, although I'll say to my own detriment that I was once corrected by an old friend of mine, Bill Rusher, when I was complaining about something Reagan did, and he said, "You're still too young," he says, "my boy." He says, "You're going to remember this as a golden time." Well, I do respect Ronald Reagan very greatly, and I think he was a very serious man, and I think him more serious as time goes by than I did even while he was president, when I was, in fact, a supporter of his. And the reason, a lot of it has to do with his first inaugural address. And those addresses are very interesting things because, it's true that in some ways America is a very young country. I began by describing how long it took for Great Britain to become the kind of thing it is today, much longer than America has been alive. But in another sense, America is the oldest country in the world. And the reason is it has the longest living written constitution in all of history. And Aristotle says in one of his books that if you're watching a play and the chorus, Greek plays had choruses, they all on the stage and they're wearing a comic mask or they're performing a comic function in the chorus, and then they all leave and come back and now they've got on a dark or a tragic mask. Even though the chorus is made of the same people, is it the same chorus? And Aristotle says, no, it's a new chorus. And by the way, if in the same play all the comic chorus goes off and changes masks with a bunch of guys, so they're all very different people, they come back on with the same mask on, but then it's the same chorus still. So the Constitution sort of makes us what we are, and the forms of the Constitution still survive extensively, and one of those forms is that every president of the United States from George Washington forward has had an inauguration day where he's given a speech of about the same scope and length, and then he's taken an oath of office, or vice versa. I can't remember which comes first, but that's the occasion. So George Washington gave such a speech. His first one is particularly beautiful. Ronald Reagan's first one is very beautiful. And it's worth looking at. It's very good. And it is, as I say, an exception to the story of the first half. Now, Reagan does something remarkable in the speech. Reagan is the first president to hold his inauguration. They've all been held at or around what functioned at as the Capitol at that time, where the legislature meets. But I was just at the Capitol the other day, and my friend Tom McClintock, as I mentioned, gave me a tour. Reagan moved his around the back to the west side of the Capitol, the side looking at the National Mall, and that had never been done before. It is more commonly done now. But I'll mention to you why he did it, because he explains. And I want to start by explaining how, first of all, you've got the speech there. It's easy to find. Notice how it begins. To a few of us here today, this is a solemn and most momentous occasion. And yet, in the history of our nation, it is a commonplace occurrence. Now, who are the few he's talking about? He's got to be talking about his family, right? And himself and his friends. This is a big day for us. Wow, I'm the president. But he immediately demotes that sentence and that sentiment. In the history of our nation, it is a commonplace. The orderly transfer of authority is called for in the Constitution routinely takes place, as it has for almost 2 centuries, and few of us stop to think how unique we really are. So now, look, first, it's a big deal for me and my family, but for the nation, it's a commonplace. But then another uniqueness arises, and that is for our nation as a whole, compared to other nations, nobody does this. The orderly exchange of power from one party or person to another according to the democratic will of a free people happened for the first time in human history in 1800 in the United States of America. And it has been happening regularly ever since. And Reagan calls this, in the first sentence, a miracle. Then he says, in the present crisis, and there's a bad economic crisis, and we're having a lot of trouble in foreign policy, and the Soviet Union's threatening the heck out of us in those days. Government, he says, is not the solution to the problem. Something else is. And there he raises what is the theme of the speech. He says, from time to time, we have been tempted in America to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule. Self-rule is the theme of the speech. Government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. But if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else? That echoes a very famous thing that Abraham Lincoln said. Stephen Douglas had said to Lincoln in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln thinks that the good people of Nebraska are good enough to govern themselves, but they're not good enough to govern a few miserable Negroes, he said. And Lincoln replied to him in paraphrase. He said, well, I think the good people of Nebraska are as good as the good people anywhere, but no people is good enough to govern somebody else against his consent. They must govern themselves and not others. And Reagan, was a very famous president for having heroes as his State of the Union address. And he'd always have somebody there who'd done some great thing. Sometimes it was a school teacher, sometimes it was a soldier. And he'd get them to stand up and tell a story about them. And the first heroes come into this first inaugural address. We Americans, he says, have every right to dream heroic dreams. Those who say that we're in a time when there are no heroes, they just don't know where to look. And then he talks about us working and taking care of our families and our deep patriotism and our values, which he says sustain our national life. And then he says, I've used these words they and their in speaking of these heroes, but I should say you. So in other words, it becomes kind of personal now. Reagan sort of looks into the camera, I remember, and he's looking at me, and he's looking at you, and he says, you have these responsibilities. Because if government in this circumstance, he doesn't say all circumstances, but if government in this circumstance is not the solution, what is? And the answer is you. You are the solution. Under a system of self-rule. And he tells us why he moved it around to the back of the Capitol to look at the National Mall. This is the first time in history that this ceremony has been held, as you've been told, on the west front of the Capitol. Standing here, one faces a magnificent vista opening on the city's special and beautiful history. And now he's got some more heroes to describe to you. Directly in front of me, the monument to a monumental man, George Washington, father of our country. A man of humility who came to greatness reluctantly. He led Americans out of revolutionary victory into infant nationhood. Off to one side, the stately memorial to Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, flames with his eloquence. Isn't that nice? And then beyond the reflecting pool, the dignified columns of the Lincoln Memorial. And by the way, if you've never been to that, go sometime just after nightfall and stand there. Try to find a quiet night. And read on the left the Gettysburg Address and read on the right the second inaugural. Kind of a pronouncement of justice, that second thing. If every drop of blood drawn by the lash through 200 years of the bondsman's unrequited toil must now be repaid with another drawn by the sword. The judgment on the Civil War, see. Still, it must be said that the ways of God are righteous altogether. Very beautiful. And then beyond, Reagan writes, the reflecting pool, the dignified columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Whoever would understand in his heart the meaning of America will find it in the life of Abraham Lincoln. Isn't that pretty? So we take a little tour and think what they're being saluted for, right? Washington was humble and came to greatness reluctantly. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, which establishes our rights, and only through that, his greatness. And Lincoln, a common and obedient man, claiming the ways of God even in a terrible strife for which we all paid an awful cost, are righteous altogether. So when the mighty are described, they come to sight as the humble. And when the humble are described, the heroism in them is noticed. Isn't that pretty, by the way? Reagan did that. And then we go back to the individual after we've dealt with these mighty and great. Beyond these monuments to heroism is the Potomac River, and on the far shore, the sloping hills of Arlington National Cemetery, with its row on row of simple white markers bearing crosses and stars of David. They add up to only a tiny fraction of the price that has been paid for our freedom. Now, who paid the price, see? He calls them heroes, like the ones he's been discussing, And that collapses the two kinds of heroes he's mentioned so far in the speech. Ordinary people at work, taking care of their families, serving their neighbors, educating their kids is one kind, and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln is another kind, but they're collapsed into the same kind now. And they're grouped with all those people who've given their lives for our country. And then Reagan mentions a bunch of battlefields where they did that. And of course, some of them were the most terrible places on earth to be, and the great majority of the people at Tarawa and Pork Chop Hill and Guadalcanal didn't come back when they went there. It's lovely, right? But then, more dramatic yet, here at the end, Reagan individualizes the point. Under one such marker lies a young man, Martin Treptow, who left his job in a small-town barber shop in 1917 to go to France with the famed Rainbow Division. That's the first American expeditionary force abroad. There on the Western Front, he was killed carrying a message between battalions. We are told, says Reagan, that on his body was found a diary. And on the flyleaf under the heading, "My Pledge," he wrote in the diary, he had written these words, "America must win this war. Therefore I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure. I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost, as if the issue of the whole struggle depended on me alone." Think what that means. Isn't that one of the most radical statements of self-government you've ever read anywhere, ever written by anyone? Each of us is an agent of the people and the government of the United States, and each of us is A, entitled to the full share of authority over all its doings, and B, responsible, just like George Washington was responsible, for the way each of us discharges his duty under self-rule. It's the power, you see, of constitutional rule. It enlists each person in the business of governance and gives each person the authority that any governor is entitled to hold. I said that the material cause of the United States of America is the people and the land of the United States of America, a unique people and a blessed and very large land. I said that the efficient cause of the United States of America is the founders who made the country and laid out its design, people who, like Michelangelo, I think, had a special communion with the high things in nature and could portray them to us so we could see them too. I said that the formal cause of the United States of America is its Constitution, which gives the avenues and means and methods by which we act, and which divides power along lines that James Madison compares to the whole order of nature, with God above and man in the middle and beast below. And I said that the final cause was the principle stated in the Declaration of Independence. In the end, those principles meaning that unique place in nature that each of us has, the beast on earth capable of reflecting the divine. Now, Reagan, in that speech, it seems to me, revives that kind of understanding. Somehow he possessed it. Didn't really... there's a funny joke about Reagan. He mentioned this in a speech. One time some journalist, doubtless a graduate of an elite university, had commented that Mr. Reagan, President Reagan, was a C student from a little bitty college in Illinois, Eureka College, I think is where he went. And Reagan said, I've thought of that often. And he said, I often thought to myself, if only I had studied harder, who knows how far I might have gone. And it does seem to me that that speech is important because Reagan today is revered by everyone. It's not very controversial for me to say today that I liked him. Most everybody says that. And when he was alive, it wasn't quite so common. But now it is. And what that means is if somebody can have success in American politics in this time, and it's 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but it's not that far ago, not that long ago, then that means that those ideas are alive. And that means that the argument that we're having is real. And that means it isn't over. And there is a teaching about the liberal arts that living in communion with such arguments is one part of the purpose of life. And there is a teaching in the founding of all the great nations, and in the literature and the discourse of all great nations, that such things are what make those nations great. And so the greatness of our nation is not gone, as long as we are reading these books and thinking about what they mean. And the chance to save it for what it was, if that's what our choice is open, as long as we can read these books and say what it means.